And a very good afternoon to all. Welcome to the fourth and final of public fora held by the Faculty of Sport at the University of the West Indies, focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on sport in the region. As you would have gathered over the last 3 weeks, we've had a wide-ranging look at all the effects that COVID has had on sport in the region and how it may have repercussions going forward. However, today's program, which focuses on sport policy and sports governance, is honored to have amongst it some of the major policy makers of the Caribbean. And I'm happy to welcome Honorable John King, Minister of Creative Economy, Culture and Sports of the Government of Barbados, the Honorable Norland Cox, Minister of Youth Development, Sports, Culture and the Arts from Grenada, along with Nelson Chris Stokes, well known in Jamaica as a 4-time Olympian with the bobsled team and a sports entrepreneur who I'll introduce even further later on. And as our fourth member of the panel, Mr. Kervin, the head of the Open Campus Academy of Sport, who himself has done a lot in sports policy, especially in Trinidad and Tobago and his native St. Lucia, who is our representative on the panel from the Open Campus as well. This session will be co-hosted by Mrs. Amanda Reifer, who is the head of the Cave Hill Academy of Sport, and I am Akshai Mansingh, the Dean of the Faculty of Sport. So welcome to all, and I'm going to start off by asking Amanda, how are things in Barbados, and where do we go with sports policy?
Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Good afternoon to all of the panelists. Barbados, we're just ready and raring to go. Actually, earlier today, I met with Minister King on another matter. So I've been seeing him pretty often on Zoom and on WhatsApp. Very happy we're doing some really tremendous work here in Barbados. I'm sure he will speak about that later. But we are delighted to be here. I believe we are coming out of lockdown slowly. I believe next week we go into phase 3. So we're just looking forward to getting back into some form of normalcy, albeit with social distancing and taking the necessary precautions.
Well, Minister King, straight to you. Minister of Creative Economy, Culture and Sports. That's like a triple whammy when COVID came along. That would have hit every aspect of your ministry. But how did it affect you strategically and operationally?
All right, so one of the things that we were undertaking just prior to it was a massive refurbishment of a lot of the infrastructure that we own as a National Sports Council. So we have basketball courts, we have playing fields, and we got a gymnasium, skate park, all these things. So we have begun to do some refurbishments in some of the schools, the playing fields and stuff like that. We've got National Stadium also to do. It came in and wiped out all of the work that we were actually undertaking at that particular point in time. We're actually looking forward now as things open back up to start back that particular process. The thinking was, when we came in, we looked at what was happening in the communities, and we realized that a lot of sporting activities, even in terms of sporting clubs, were going down. And people were complaining that there were not a lot of good facilities around. So we thought that that would have been one of the major places where we wanted to start the development process. And that's what we did. In terms of the operations of the actual thing, now you would have heard me mention the National Sports Council. That can be considered to be the executing arm of the ministry itself. And they're responsible for coaching programs that we do in schools and across the island. So what has been happening now, a lot of the coaches are now doing stuff online. In fact, actually, they released a lot of stuff this week. They started about in 15 different disciplines. So we've kind of like recovered from that. It gives us a chance now to extend the programs, not just to children in schools, but for anyone who could go online and see what's happening. So it's hindered us in terms of the physical development of things that we were doing, but it gave us an opportunity to move into the digital space to engage with a lot wider cross-section of people in terms of the coaching program.
Amanda.
Thank you, Minister King. Can I ask Minister Cox what sort of impact COVID-19 has had in Grenada on his ministry from a strategic and operational standpoint? Minister Cox.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Reifer, and a pleasure to be here on the panel discussion this evening. COVID has probably struck a serious blow to our operations and strategic approach. One of the things that we would have been focusing a lot on this year is our sporting events. They are major revenue earners for Grenada and pushing our local economic activity. And so we had things like, of course, the Grenada Invitational. This year we had our national sports meet, which didn't come off last year for other reasons. And we had the Winner Islands school games. So those three events, we were looking towards having those. Well, we had cricket. Cricket came off quite wonderful. And so from that standpoint, in terms of infrastructure, we had scheduled a major renovation for our national cricket stadium and also some repairs on the athletic stadium as well, between $20 million or so, thereabout. And so that is on hold. That is not going to happen. And so that has really affected us. And we have some other infrastructure work on some of our smaller fields and hard courts. So basically, it's in that area that it has really affected us. In terms of the whole operations with our coaches, we were able to operate, have some coaching done during especially during the intense part when we were locked down right throughout. We were a little bit pushing with the authorities, the police, to allow it to happen, mainly so for the elite athletes. We thought that it was critical for them to continue to have that training going on and the mindset, the physical, psychological and physical aspect of their development. Not because they're not be going to Olympics this year or some of the sporting meets, international and otherwise sport meets, but they need to stay active. And so we had some discussions with the coaches and a couple of fields were identified. And so those athletes were able to continue to work out and train for the greater part of the lockdown. So that is what really happened, and we are pleased about that.
So have you gotten, Minister, as a follow-up, any feedback directly from the athletes? I know that athlete welfare is a big concern for you, a big focus. You know, there would have been impact from a financial standpoint. You spoke about the technical and the coaching that would have been an assistance to them. What about the mental state? Can you share any feedback you gotten directly from the coaches from what you've implemented?
Well, one of the things that happened initially is that we reached out to our athletes, especially those overseas, because those the countries outside, especially the US, is more heavily impacted. So we were very concerned, and just to find out that persons are okay, keeping safe. So that was the first outreach. But we have been working very closely with the Olympic Committee here locally on island, and they have been providing from their end financial support through the mechanism to ensure the athletes are doing pretty okay. And so that has been happening very well. Initially, we had some challenges in working out the logistics in terms of the coaches and the local training on the ground, adhering to the protocols. But over time, everything worked well, and the feedback has been quite positive.
Minister King, I know sport is at the heart of every Barbadian, and the government has really expended a lot of resources in the past, not just in cricket, but in supporting athletes. And with an Olympic year, I'm sure there are allocations made to athletes going to Tokyo. Now, have you been able to recoup any of that, and what sort of facilities can you extend, assuming that we're going to have Olympics next year in 2021?
Okay, so I guess the unfortunate thing about it is that none of that is going to be recoupable. You talk about money that would have been spent in terms of nutrition and other things like that for your athletes, but I don't even look at it as being a loss as such, because I know some people say it's money lost, but for me it's money well spent. So what we basically be looking at is to be able to sustain that as we go forward. Now in Barbados, I don't know what happens across the Caribbean, but in Barbados, for instance, we have an arrangement with our lotteries where we get money from the lotteries that is to help with the promotion of culture and sport. So at least we have that safety net, so to speak. And a lot of money doesn't have to come from central government to do a lot of the things that we need for our athletes. So that is fairly sustainable at this particular point in time. So through that, we will be able to continue the programs and the support that we've been giving so far.
Do you see any major change in policy, major shift? You said lottery, but presumably with a downturn in the economy, there might even be a decrease in intake from the lottery itself. Do you see any fundamental policy shift with respect to what COVID has done to your country and even the region?
Yeah, well, I think one of the major things is that you have to be sensible in terms of how you allocate monies at this particular point in time. And yes, one of the things that we've been actively pursuing with the Barbados Olympic Association is sharing, I don't want to use the word burden, but sharing how we support the athletes, especially the ones that are going to the Olympics. So that if with the two of us combined, we can cushion any fallout that may occur, again, from those monies coming in from the lotteries. So we've started those discussions even prior to COVID. And so now would be the time where we look at that. And yes, that could be part and parcel of our shift in policy in terms of how we deal with it.
Thank you, Minister King. To Minister Cox, again, we're interested in finding out how you would have engaged the national federations during this period. I'm assuming that their operational and administrative activities would have been severely affected. Have you gotten any feedback from national federations in Grenada as to the impact of COVID and what support you intend to put forward to them as a result?
Well, the national federations, really and truly, they received the financial support at the starting of the year, so they would have had resources, and the challenge that they have indicated to us is just the ability for at least the stakeholders not to participate in the functions, not being able to have the events. So that is where the real challenge is, having people go out and play, and compete. But in terms of the resources, I think that is not an issue. Because they were able to draw down on those beforehand, before COVID, based on the approvals they would submit sometime at the end of the year. So they would have their budget approved early. And so they haven't indicated any challenges in terms of finances. Just to piggyback a little bit on what Minister King mentioned regarding how we finance our operations. And we have a similar construct in terms of working with the National Lotteries Authority here in Grenada as well, that provides support for sports, culture, and national development and nation building initiatives. So it's the same construct, and it's one of the issues that we have raised and we have flagged in as our policy going forward. We do not believe that how sport is financed right now is not sustainable. Not sustainable in the sense that it is not enough for the investment that we want to make in the development of our athletes and persons who have potential to go further. So we have been having some discussions, and I think I did mention with Kervin when we met. We've been looking at a modality of having probably developing a trust fund. Maybe various islands can come together and develop a trust fund where after, say, maybe a decade or so after it matures, it will generate a certain amount of revenue that each country can draw down on. If not, we can look at it even from a national level, where federations, from the support, the subvention that they receive outside, we can establish this trust fund, and it can generate a certain amount we can put in based on what we want to get out of it, and have that fund finance sports and ease off some of the burden on government, of course, and ease off some of the burden on the facilities that we have for financing, like the national lotteries, and also the public sector, the private sector in Grenada has given us enormous support in terms of development. Just recently this week, I had a meeting where they wanted to put some money in sports to look at whatever facilities that we have deficiencies in to assist in the development of sports. So that is the whole construct that we have, but that is the policy direction which we go in. in terms of financing sports in Grenada.
Has there been any cross-Caribbean ministerial consultations in terms of Minister of Sports to the two ministers?
Well, I certainly, I have to speak to him as soon as we finish it, because I have something that I want to discuss with him urgently. When I got the invitation, I said, look, I had to call him, so I didn't call him and say, after we speak today, and we're going to have a quick chat, and then we'll discuss a few things. I have a few things in mind.
Well, you're free to have an open discussion now if you want, Amanda.
Probably not today. You know how we politicians are sometimes. We leave things, not everything for the public. Everything is due course.
Well, Minister Cox, I'm happy to hear that the private sector are still very willing to invest in sport in Grenada. I would like to ask Minister King, there's a lot of doom and gloom being presented around the world about the impact on businesses and corporations. Have you gotten a sense, Minister, of what the corporate sector in Barbados are saying? Have they said anything to you? Already we'd had some challenges in terms of the level of investment. So just wanted to find out what's the conversation being had there in that respect.
Well, I think in Barbados you have some normal players, so to speak, let me put it that way, who would always be involved in whatever sport it is, and we have a wide array of sports that happen on island. Again, with the tourism drive to them, and pretty much like what Mr. Cox was speaking about, that is where you find the investment most of all from the private sector. In terms of our refurbishing program, you would have companies who would, let's say, supply paint, not necessarily supply finances to do that, but would come in and help. And they're still pretty much on board and pretty willing to do what we requested of them. So our conversations really now are about more, when do we start back with the refurbishment projects, and how do we move forward, more than actually seeking actual funding to do things. Because I think one of the things that you have to bear in mind that we do have an extremely small population. And so if you use, let's say, 1% of your people actually being actively involved in sports, that kind of, it doesn't call for a lot of money, so to speak, to do a lot of the things that we need done. We've done a pretty good job in facilities and that sort of stuff. When you talk about the elite athletes now, I've been trying to do some calculations and talking to some of my colleagues across the Caribbean and other parts of the world, like in Canada, for instance. When these guys were explaining to me the amount of money that they have to spend and the amount of hours that they have to put in to get one athlete ready for Olympics, that is way beyond, if you're being reasonable, what we can do. And a lot of the athletes that we have who are actually at that stage are overseas, pretty similar to what Mr. Cox was saying. So what we try to do is to support them as best as we can from this end. But a lot of the stuff that is needed, and I would agree with you, as you said earlier, you need some more intake. But I think knowing how COVID is and what the ramifications are going forward, I think everyone has to think in terms of how do we make best use of what we have, and then look at maybe changing how we deal with it as we go forward. But I would say that we are pretty comfortable at this point in time.
That being said, we will be willing to engage any corporate donors who are outside of that inner circle, as you said, Minister. Thank you for that. I think this is a very good time to introduce into the discussion Mr. Kervin John, the head of Open Campus Academy of Sport. We've been speaking about new funding models. Minister Cox would have mentioned a new and innovative way he's looking to finance sport in Grenada. Kervin, can we get you in to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities? They say never waste a good crisis. So from a sport policy and sport governance perspective, what are some of the ideas that you've been thinking about in terms of how we can approach post-COVID?
Thank you, Amanda, and good afternoon again to everybody. I do think it presents a plethora of opportunities. You see, in sport, most times the administration of sport and the operational side of sport tend to be in contention. With the operational side, we're constantly going from meet to meet, event to event, organization to organization. We tend to be disconnected a bit from our policy and strategic directions. This current situation offers us a chance to align those operations, to have alignment between administration and operations, as well as our policy direction, to realign our policies. One of the things I've found in the region, especially, most of our operations tend to be separate and apart from our policy direction. The policies would say one thing, but then when you look at what happens in sport, it's totally different without much time to sit down and have that realignment. Given the way things are going now with the operational side on a slow, more or less, on a downturn, it gives us an opportunity to go back to the drawing board, look at our policies, evaluate where we're at. It even offers us a chance to look at our operations itself and see what's going on, what is working for us, what is not working for us, and have that realignment. Our strategies tend to be out of sync with our policies, so we do have that time to go back to the drawing board and align those, right? Given the fact that, one, emanating out of this crisis, we know we're going to be facing some serious budget cuts. I tend to tell persons we tend to treat sport as a bad stepchild in most instances. If you look at any policy, you'll see the amount of benefits we tend to recoup from sport. We want from sport, but then when you look at the inputs that go into that, they don't match up. There's this quality. So coming out of this, we know we're going to have budget cuts, especially sport. Sport tends to be, we tend to speak a lot of sport development, but when you look at the whole pie, sport tends to get that smaller piece. So given that we're going to be facing that cut after this and post this, in fact, we're facing it now, we have to then ask ourselves, okay, how can we be more efficient as sport ministries, as sport administrations? And a thing we may have to look at is our operations per se. In some instances, there is a lot of wastage that we don't take into account. As well as wastage, we tend to have duplications across agencies. So I think the opportunities lie right now for us as the administration, as some of us the direction, to offer direction, to the operational side of sport.
Well, I think, we're going to take up a bit about that mismatch between operation and policy. And Minister Cox, and I'm going to put it to both ministers, but Minister Cox, Mr. Jean has spoken about this, and you find that, you'll have a policy, but the operationalization of it would be somewhat affected by resources, by circumstances, COVID notwithstanding. Is there much of a mismatch in your own policy and how you affect it? And do you see this as a time to really sort of recalibrate?
It's a very, very important area. And I think from Grenada's standpoint is not so much of a mismatch, but probably a gap. I think when I started here in 2018, there was a draft sports policy, national sports policy, that was drafted since 2012. And so it was not implemented. And so we began the discussions in terms of reviewing it and having it ratified, and also to develop an implementation plan that matches that policy document and to start to implement it. And that is where we are currently right now. We had, with some support from UWI, to have the review done. It's currently with our stakeholders, the various sporting associations and federations. So they are reviewing to give feedback. And then we prepare that final document, have cabinet approve it, and then we take it down now to the ministry level and for implementation. And so what has happened over the past few years is that a lot of the policies and operational activities have been driven either by what person may believe or like, or probably either what might be a trend at the time, what might be happening at the time, or what another country might be doing at the time, but nothing from an organized and concise way from a policy standpoint. And we have had a lot of calls, a loud cry from Grenadian sporting enthusiasts, persons who are passionate about sports and the development of sports in Grenada. Even a call for recently with Anderson Peters winning the World Championship in javelin, a call for special academy for throwing. We have one of our top coaches, Paul, who is doing well and very successful. And so all the discussions and suggestions now must be tied in with a policy approach. And that is why it takes me back to the issue of financing. We may have wonderful ideas, wonderful opportunities before us, but if we do not have the capacity to finance those, then we are going to fall short. But
and as you heard from Mr. Jean, that might actually get even harder with what's ahead of us. But before I put the same question to Minister King, just want to remind the viewers that you can post your questions on our YouTube channel, and we will put them to any of the panelists as they come. So please feel free to participate, put in your questions or your comments, and they will be considered. But Minister King, once again, that disparity between policy and operationalization, gosh, I'm stammering today. How do you recalibrate? Do you need to recalibrate? Is there going to be some sort of hit with the budget cuts and so on? Where do we go with this?
Well, sitting here listening to Minister Cox is almost like listening to my own story. I mean, we've come in at the same time, 2018. There was a draft policy here also. We were in the process, and Amanda could attest to this, of reviewing it. And actually, we've made some adjustments to it. And we were just about getting ready to start promotions for basically putting it out there for the public. But I think one of the things where you get that disconnect is that, and I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I can speak to what I've seen here in Barbados for a number of years. You have policies that are made, but they're not communicated properly to the persons who have to work with the policies. And that is one of the things that I intend to definitely challenge and change as we go forward. So when we speak about the engagement with stakeholders and stuff, all of that would have been done with the draft. It was just for it to be laid in Parliament and all the other things that needs to be done for the policy to go through. But now that we've got to make these changes, we've got to go back through that bit of a process all over again and re-engage them. And with COVID, that is going to bring some changes. One of the things that I've been very passionate about in terms of where sport and the sporting policy is concerned is the actual business side of the sport. Now, people all the time, I shouldn't say all the time, but lots of the time, we speak only towards, the aspects that are like medicine and actual playing of the games and stuff like that. But I think in the Caribbean, we have to begin to start looking at monetizing these sports. And if you haven't done it as yet in some places, in Barbados, we've been thinking about 2 or 3 sports to start off with that are very popular are indigenous road tennis. And what are the policies that you need to put in place to even when people are putting on sporting activities? Because what can happen is you can have entrepreneurs out there bringing people to Barbados to do sports. How do you make sure that there is a particular standard within which things are done, that it doesn't end up with you getting a bad rap for things that somebody else has done? So these are some of the things that we're going to be seriously pursuing as we go forward in amendments to the policy.
Kervin, I think you had a comment to make?
Yes, Dean. Just piggybacking off what Minister King said. And we tend to see that a lot in the Caribbean, where we develop policies and we just have standalone policies. In most instances, those policies end up on a shelf. For those of them who even make it to being a policy, because we have policies from as long as 1995 being trying to be implemented or developed that have never seen the light of day. I think one of the major things that we need to take note of is not just development of your policy. Developing your policy is just the first step in a long way to go. With a policy without the support documents, whether your implementation and operational plans, is nothing. Developing the policy is just the first step. And one of the things that we don't do when we develop policy is have integrated policies, and we don't mainstream our policies. Sport, for instance, is not a standalone industry. Because of the malleability of sport, sports transcend the number of ministries and the mandates. So we have ministries of national security, we have social and community development, we have Ministry of Education. And if you have a policy that is disconnected from each and every single one of those policies, you are going to run into problems. So in addition to what the minister said in terms of not communicating the policies, I think a lot of times we fail to integrate our policies into the other policy mandates of our supporting ministries, which leads to trouble because we don't have enough funding on our own as a ministry, most sport ministries, to support. We have to depend on these other sister ministries to lend support, whether it be funding to youth development and other crime reduction initiatives. So if you have a policy, one, that is not integrated into theirs, you will not get the funding. Two, there is no communication of policy in terms of mainstreaming the policy. Now that we've developed a policy, taking that policy, ensuring that our stakeholders know what that policy means, they know their role in the implementation of that policy and operationalizing that policy, we're going to run into trouble. And we've seen that countlessly across the region, where we develop a policy and say, yes, we have a sport policy, but that's it. So I just wanted to add what Minister is saying there. At the end of the day, for us to have a holistic policy, it has to be developed appropriately. More so, the support mechanisms for that policy need to be developed alongside that policy. So when it is finished, we actually have a plan moving forward to say, okay, this is how we're going to implement that policy. This is the 5 years, and this is how it's going to be transacted.
Thank you, Kervin. Can I have some comments from the ministers on this, what Kervin just spoke about in terms of integration? Minister Cox, do you want to offer some feedback there?
Sure, I totally agree with what Kervin just indicated. Like with other initiatives, government would normally mainstream that into the budgeting. Like, for example, in recent times, we have been talking a lot about climate change. And you find when you're budgeting, your budget and your mainstream climate change in your budgeting. So if sports, we believe sports has that significant economic value and impact, social and otherwise, then it should be not a stepchild of the National Development Plan, but also it should be mainstream in the whole mix of things as part of an economic development initiative. So I strongly agree with that.
Can I ask Minister King, where would you say sport is positioned in the whole context of national development in Barbados?
I think it has to be very high on the list. Let's not just look at sport as a recreational thing, but let's look at it from a health and wellness perspective. In terms of where you have a country as small as ours battling with non-communicable diseases and stuff like that, sport is integral to the development of our people, health-wise and otherwise. There's sports tourism, as I mentioned earlier. So you look at the economic side of it, you're looking at the health side of it. It's high on our list. But I think Kervin made the point just now, that there has to be that inter-ministerial dialogue to ensure that the policy itself has teeth. And like he said, it's not just a document that sits on a desk somewhere or locked up somewhere. One of the things that you find, like for instance, I've started the conversations with the Ministry of Finance. One of the things that we realized when we got here that was a major problem is that a lot of our federations were getting gifts of equipment coming from all over the world. And a lot of this stuff ends up in the port, accumulating huge amounts of taxes, and just based on the fact that there's nothing that says, look, when you get these gifts, there's a policy that says, these are duty-free coming in, it's for sport, it's for the development, all of that sort of stuff. So these are the things that we started those conversations just about the middle of last year to get these things rectified. Because as you're sporting, the amount of people in different sports and stuff starts to expand. You're going to need to be able to give them that kind of a support, especially for the athletes and others too, who might need equipment and other things to get them to the next level. So I think, as Minister Cox would have said, this is really, really important from that standpoint to give them the leg up that they need.
So I'd like to just apologize to the viewers for not bringing in Mr. Nelson Chris Stokes before this, but we just lost contact with him momentarily and hence had to wait for him to recontact. So just to remind everyone that Chris Stokes is well known in Jamaica as our bobsledding 4-time Olympian, sports entrepreneur, and somebody who's just about to finish his doctorate on economic development policy, and therefore well versed with advising ministers of sport and driving policy in Jamaica. But two bigger questions for you, Chris. Number one, your role in the Jamaica Olympic Association, and number two, who played you in Cool Runnings?
I was going to ask that. That's my favorite movie growing up. So I was
wow. Okay. Well, first of all, Doc, Chair. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, to be listening to these very insightful comments. I am, as you know, first vice president of the Jamaica Olympic Association, an organization led by Mr. Christopher Samuda with a long and very rich history in Jamaica of supporting development of sport, not just track and field. People tend to align Jamaica with track and field, but of course we are much more than that. As it relates to Cool Runnings, I have a standard answer. I ask people, who is the best looking actor in a movie? And they tell me Leon. So I say, well, that's me. That's as far as.
Well, Chris, I don't know if you're able to hear most of the conversation in terms of Minister Cox coming with a brilliant idea about this fund, trust fund that could help generate some funds in the future for athletes. And then Minister King talking about just sports policy and the fact that, as important as it is, sometimes people just don't have even simple things like getting gifts and how to deal with them. But from the Jamaican perspective and JOA, Jamaica Olympic Association perspective, and your own federation and so on, how is policy and your advising the government affected by COVID? And from the discussions we've had, how does that sort of ring with Jamaica? Okay,
so thank you for that. It's a very deep and wide question, but just bear with me. Let me make a couple of comments that were in relation to what Minister Cox and King had said previously, both of whom I know by 2 or 3 degrees of separation, but that's another conversation. The idea of a fund, a trust fund, which we see in universities, is fine. How do you fund it? I every now and again I go back and I read about our tragedy or trauma going through creating the West Indies Federation and what the learnings from that and coming into CARICOM. And I do wonder if there's a role for a regional body that would put in some funds, invest it, and then returns go back to whomever. Now, everybody here understand the political disaster that could become and fight that could become. But it is worth pursuing. We are faced, however, with a more fundamental challenge, which is this, which is that the sports that we tend to participate in large numbers are successful at are not the sports where, as a friend of mine would say out of the US, where the dough at, where the money is at. So think about professional soccer, think about basketball, football, even in Europe, the leagues, the handball and these kind of leagues where there's big money. That's not where our focus has been. Therefore, we don't have an opportunity from a private sector perspective to generate, need some water, to generate the kind of earning capacity that you would want to fund these sports. So we're left with amateur sports with very little earning capacity, and therefore we're left with a problem. One of the things I'd want to put on the table, bringing my banking background into sport, is, for example, why not have a venture capital fund for sport that you could invest in, or invest in an athlete with the contractual arrangement that if you quote unquote go public, or as we say in Jamaica, you boss, or you become successful, I get a return, right? So let me leave that idea on the table. I'm going to get some water here.
Well, interesting concept, because what we're getting here is a lot of ideas coming out, and that thing about a capital fund or even a regional sports fund collection. The only 2 regional institutions where we've seen that sort of emphasis is Cricket West Indies and to some extent UWI, and both of them I think are suffering from the fact that when things get tight, it's very hard for the region to be thought of above a country and so on. But Chris, are you back with us, and have you had your water?
Yes, I am. Yes. I think I'm getting it right now. Thank you very much. What relief. I'm back with you.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, with regards to Jamaica so we're talking about Jamaica and the impact of COVID and sport policy and governance.
Right. So the Jamaican government has been working at upgrading its sport policy. Now, as an unapologetic capitalist and a libertarian, I would want to go down this road very carefully. There is a role for sport policy when it comes to government objectives of reducing crime and violence, creating opportunities for youth, education, and so on. that it is much easier to link policy with what happens on the ground, especially through schools and community organizations. You do, however, have a diversion later on when people start to compete internationally, and it now becomes a private endeavor, a private undertaking. And therefore, the degree that you can influence what happens there is necessarily reduced. So I think what we need to do is, you know, there are countries that have a policy for winning medals. You have seen Canada have tremendous success with that. But we are not there. What we need to do is to use sport to improve health, reduce diabetes, heart conditions, reduce violence, get the kids off the street. That is where our sport policy should be focusing, not to get two out of 300,000 on a podium in some far out land. As noble as an achievement as that may be. So I think we need to be careful what the scope of a policy is. And I would want to invite the ministers perhaps to comment on that perspective from a sort of a private sector view.
Sure. Well, I mean, comments from the minister. And just to add to that, I was actually going to ask about the SDGs, the Sustainable Growth Development factors put out by the UNESCO, by UN, and they look just at what Mr. Stokes said, which is sport for community development. So perhaps we can get that comment from both ministers. Minister King.
Yeah, I was about to say that Mr. Stokes would have hit the proverbial nail on the head there. That should be our focus. But the reality is that we don't live in a world by ourselves. And a lot of the people around us, not administrators or others, but the general public, and also always measure the success of sport. And we've seen it also in terms of entertainment, of which I'm pretty much well versed and stuff, by how much medals people get, how much top athletes we got in Olympics and World Championships and all the other things. But I think for small developing islands like states like ours, the emphasis must be, as Mr. Stokes said, on getting our young people involved in wholesome things like sports to keep, crime among juvenile delinquency and stuff down, keeping people healthy. And I think once the policies empower and give teeth to the community groups on the ground and the entrepreneurs, with the persons who have like the little home gyms and all the other things like that, I think that is where you get your biggest gains in terms of sport having the kind of impact on the society that you will want it to.
And can I ask Minister Cox to comment? I'm sure he's biting at the bits, and Kervin also wants to comment. Mr. Stokes, you just stoked serious fire.
Among the praise.
So go ahead, Minister Cox, and then Kervin.
So I understand his approach and thinking, and while that might be true, I have to agree with my colleague minister as to what that national expectation that lies out there. Yes, there is persons get caught up in the whole euphoria about having the name of the country out there, seeing your flag hoist in another country. That is deemed and seen as a significant achievement. But I still think that there is an opportunity for other layers from a policy approach. And I could speak to some more of what we have been doing recently, is that every engagement that we make, not directly for sports, but in terms of youth development, we have been looking at opportunities for scholarship for persons in sports, because being an athlete or sports it has a lifespan. What happens to the athlete thereafter? When we look into our communities, some of our most outstanding athletes, they're destitute, and so we have a responsibility as government and as policymakers to fix that, to change that. So I think that through empowerment, through having a career after sports, be it business or otherwise, it has been a major policy drive for us. quietly, but it's something that we're doing in the back burner, helping. We even go as far to helping, planning to help our athletes, persons who desires of going to follow their education with the SATs and things like that. So those things are critical, because what happens after sports? What happens after the lights switched off and the persons leave the stadium? I think that is where the crux of the matter is. So I understand, but I think that there is a room for those other initiatives to come in, but we cannot get away from that big expectation of seeing your flag hoist in another country and hearing the national anthem played. I mean, that is significant. Everybody look forward to that, and I think that is something that will be difficult to remove or to ignore.
And Mr. Stokes, I want to get back to you on that notion of the greater good from a policy perspective, and how do we treat them to those elite athletes. But before that, I'll invite Kervin to comment. He wanted to make mention of what you put out there.
Oh, thank you, Amanda. And I would ask you before I go on, I tend to be a bit passionate about this. So if I do start rambling, just please.
So that's why I'm the moderator, okay? That's why I'm the co-moderator. Go ahead, right ahead, Kervin.
So, Mr. Stokes, let me just put it out there. I would like to disagree to what you just said. Simple and plain. Now, understand this. We are in the Caribbean, first and foremost. So I would like to address the whole business development concept, because we don't have the resources necessary to fund sport development to the level that we want to compete at the international level. Understand that. Some of us are trying, and we're making best with our resources, and we have seen some successes in terms of podium finishes and athletes basically dominating at that stage. Yes, but I think when it comes down to true sport development, holistic sport development, as Mrs. Cox would have indicated, we need to focus our resources, our limited resources. What we are doing right now is funding countless national governing bodies. So there's a little purse, and that we have so many persons getting out of it, right? In any sport policy, you need to have two facets. One being the total participation, which is what you talk about, which is health and fitness and general upbringing, and teaching the basic tenets that sport enables us to engage youth with. And then you have the high performance and the elite side of it. You cannot then forego one for the other. They have to be done simultaneously. In fact, if you do one properly, it would facilitate the development of the other. So if you have total participation, you have your school programs, you have your community programs, that then allows you to do the talent identification needed, so then you can implement talent development programs that would facilitate development. That is your elite athletes and your high performance programs. That is your national teams and what have you. You cannot forego the two. The two of them are inseparable. You have to understand that a lot of persons, and Minister Cox would have made mention of it, a lot of our sportsmen and women come from very humble beginnings. A lot of persons who play sports, and you hear the testimonies that it was sport that actually gave them a livelihood. The problem is, we in the Caribbean see sport as fun and games. When sport is a $700 billion industry annually, we see it as fun and games, which is why we have a drop-off point. When persons hit secondary school Form 3, they tend to drop off of sport participation to take part in, to focus on the academics. But at the end of the day, we need to start looking at sport as the business that it is. And you cannot forego the high performance side, which is what's going to support and sustain those athletes that actually develop through that program you're talking about. That is the first point. Second point, in terms of the structure with regards to Minister Court spoke about, I think you need to understand in the region, sport is heavily politicized. There's no getting away from that. Government informs what happens in sports. I tell persons politics informs policy, and that sport is no different. You have to understand that. So the move has been generally to try to get sport away from the politics, which is why most persons or most countries tend to go the way of a sport commission. So to remove sport from the political influence. Now, it's somewhat feigned, because at the end of the day, if you're still getting funding from the government, you still have that control, because government could tell you where their resources are to be expended. So going the way of a commission then allows you to have those private sector funds open up, so that you could access that kind of funding to give you the leeway to implement policy, right? So in terms of what Minister Cox said, in terms of having that fund, that regional fund that we could access, I think that is a good way to go. But I do think on the ground level, there are measures that we can institute. And I normally tell persons this: if you're in a particular country, and you as a businessman, and I came to you and I told you that I would give you the license for a particular product within that country to do as you will. you would probably make a killing in terms of revenue generation, since you are the only individual who can actually exercise any kind of authority over that product. In essence, when you have a national governing body of sport, that is basically what it is. You are recognized by the government as the sole authority with responsibility for your sport. The problem is what we do with that authority. And we need to then inculcate within our NGBs that business development concept, so there isn't that great a reliance on government funding, so that you have a business.
Kervin, I wanna pause there because I wanna get Nelson's feedback on what you just said, because the discussion here now we're considering should government be responsible for only those social elements of sport policy and leave the business of sport, so to speak, to private sector? Or I'm thinking maybe you're saying, Mr. Stokes, you can elaborate, national federations, is who would be responsible for that aspect of elite sport development, funding of it, making it viable and sustainable? Can I ask you to respond there? Then
yes, please.
We'll get you back online.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for raising that. There's a temptation in life to want to be very clear, black or white. When black and white is very much on the fringes. We live in a world of gray. So allow me to start by making that point. What does that mean in this specific context? What this means is that clearly, it cannot be one or the other. Clearly, I know of elite athletes, some of whom have won medals, sometimes in small or less popular sports, on the back of direct support from the government. My point, though, is this, that I think that as a government spending, in cases taxpayers' money, the first responsibility is a broader application of sport, because believe me, there's more to sport than winning an Olympic medal. And the persons who are going to win a medal are a minuscule of percentage of persons who can benefit from sport. Mm-hmm. So let us talk about how can the country, the society benefit from sport, and let us focus on that. Those who come through, we're going to deal with them otherwise, but we would not. And I like how Minister King put it. We have not wasted the money that we have already spent. I love that. I'm going to borrow that. I hope you don't have it trademark. But we have not wasted the money that we have spent already, right? So even having done that, and somebody competes through high school, and then they now participate in sport recreationally, the health benefit to the country and to the individual is enormous. Enormous. Ask your health minister how much money they have to be spending on diabetes in 30 and 40-year-old people. Just ask them that. All right. So it's not wasted money. The point, though, that I am thinking about what Mr. Jean said, but I'm trying to hold to that point, is that there comes a point where not even the national federations, when the entrepreneurial drive and spirit of the individual and the club is what pushes you over the top in a great deal of cases. And we mustn't seek to control that. We must facilitate that. But I think we do a disservice to our people if 60, 70, 80% of the money goes chasing medals, right? When there are children drinking sugar-laced drinks and soda pop and not taking physical education in school. So I'm just saying it's a matter of perspective and balance and transition. Final point on thing I want to make on this point. One of the things I like about COVID is that it has forced us to change. I've been having meetings on Zoom for 5 years. And people say, well, let's still meet down by I don't want to go down to the coffee shop. I want to have the meeting. No, I have a reason. And I'm saying to myself, let us take advantage of that change in our mindset to ask ourselves, those sports that we are good at, we don't have to try to be good at basketball, and those sports that we are good at, how do we package it, integrate it with our tourism product, and create its own revenue stream based on that sport as entertainment? And you're talking to the guy who, by the way, was involved in starting bobsleigh in Jamaica. So I speak with some authority, I hope. Right? We can think, I hate to say this, but we can think differently, out of the box. And I think that's where we need to spend our time and energy. We need tourists flying to our country to go on the beach in the day and come in the evening to watch the sporting event. And that is what they're there for, on a wide basis. We need to package, and forgive me for putting it in these terms, we need to package our athletes as international assets and let them travel and earn a living, because we know they're going to come back and support their family and buy a home, and some even get involved in politics. Some of our musicians get involved in politics, right, Mr. King? I don't know if you have any experience with that. But let us invest in that. Let us spend some time there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stokes. I want to pick back up on that, but I know we had our ministers for a specific amount of time. So I just want to give them the opportunity to comment on what you just said. I'm sure Minister King has a comment there, and ask them to offer any final comments, and then we'll resume with the next segment of our discussion. Minister King?
Well, thank you, Amanda. I would just have to say that I totally agree with Mr. Stokes on this. I think we've been enough medals, and these things are fine. I mean, but I always guard our people from getting caught up with what they see on North American television and the things that they're saying that you measure yourself by. We have to be able to be the ones who determine what success itself is. And if success for us is only based on winning medals, we're going to be at the bottom of the ladder when you're talking about success all the time. But if, as Mr. Stokes says, success is keeping our people healthy, keeping our young people out of trouble and pretty much engaged in other things, and as Minister Cox said, giving them the opportunity for a better education, probably through sports, somewhere else. What you're really doing is you're building a better society from bottom up, using sport as a catalyst to do that. And so I'm fully supportive of that. On the other end, where Kervin was going, and I agree with him also. This is not a straightforward issue in terms of black and white. I mean, let's look at West Indies cricket, for instance. In the heyday of West Indies cricket, Caribbean, and I'm going to speak now as one who was actually born in England. I knew what it meant when West Indies came to England, and I saw my dad and other people have a complete different spring in their steps, looking at West Indies cricketers and being proud about what we would have achieved through that as a region. So that too, it has its place in building the confidence of our people and that sort of thing. But I think as small nations as we are, the real importance of sport is, again, I go back to what Mr. Stokes said, is exactly what he has spoken about. And when Mr. Stokes mentioned what he would have done with the bobsled, it gave me the chance to think back. In just a couple of months ago, wrestling was not a very big sport in Barbados. We decided to film and put online a tournament, very small tournament that was held here. And out of that, the guys who actually, again, private entrepreneurs, had the opportunity then on behalf of Barbados to go to Argentina to bid for a games, a big sporting wrestling, beach wrestling event. And they were successful. And it was the first time that we've ever done anything with wrestling on the thing. So you leverage what you have, the beaches and all the other assets that we don't pay a lot of attention to, through the same sport, to bring people here. And like you said, it gives us that opportunity now as a part of the sports tourism package to expand what it does. So I think it's not a cut and dry where. I think you have to find that happy medium between the two and let it work for you in various ways. But if you're looking at sport as a economic driver too, I think there's a lot more that we can do from that aspect, from the policy side and also from the side of facilitating entrepreneurs who want to take it forward.
Amanda, I'm
Minister,
just going to step in, Amanda, because we have a question from
Yes.
YouTube. But before we get to that question, because I know that Minister Cox had mentioned his time constraints, just a quick question to Minister Cox. How much of a pep in the step of Grenada did Karani James create? And what percentage of your budget are you willing to recreate that scenario?
I wouldn't say pep. I would say leapfrog. That was huge for Grenada, a massive for Grenada. Not just in terms of the promotion for Grenada, but also it invoked a certain level of motivation among other persons who sense that, who feels it. You know, I mean, just seeing him always bring back that memory, that time in 2012 when he won that goal, and so it's something that will always be with us because it's the first. And
but how much are you willing to invest in it? What percentage of your budget goes towards elite athletes and getting that leap again?
Well, it's both. It's done both through the federation and through the ministry. So it's a two-pronged approach in terms of investment in elite athletes. But we have invested significantly in infrastructure. We have a world-class athletic stadium. So that is a clear testament in the direction which what we believe and what we see happening with sports. Our sports in the Caribbean is local. It's local in the sense that we have an intimate relationship with the opportunities that derive from sports and the challenges that take place in sports. Some of us who can recall Kirani when he was struggling, who worked with him one-on-one. And you wouldn't hear about those persons. You would never hear about those persons, but those persons were responsible for nurturing that opportunity for himself and that opportunity for Grenada. And so it's somewhat difficult to remove some of that intrinsic political aspect of it from sports because it's within somebody's constituency, it's within somebody's community. If they have a challenge, they may go to the parliamentary rep and say, hey, look, this guy is very good. He just did a spikes. He just did some training. He needs some resources. So those are the kind of things that you cannot get away from. But I believe that what is required, it's a bigger vision. And it is something that we are questioning ourselves. Some of the sporting disciplines that we invested in, you have to ask yourself, can you really afford it?
Well, that was World Cup 2007, I think, had sort of asked those questions as well. But listen, I'm very cognizant of the time that the ministers have devoted to us, and I'm happy to have them continue. But I know that some of them had expressed that they had to leave by 4. But there's a question from YouTube land, which I think is directed to one of the ministers. So I'm going to ask Asnes just to pose that right now.
Right, so the question is for any of the ministers, because it's asking whether they have been quantifying the health benefits of sport in dollars and cents.
So has there been any quantification in dollars and cents of the benefit of sport? Minister Cox and Minister King? I
can go first. From Grenada's standpoint, I cannot recall that we're doing any macro assessment of health benefits in that regard to sports. We would have done it on the financial side, look at the economic impact, but I've never came across any document, any assessment from a health standpoint. I haven't.
And Minister King, any quantification?
No, pretty much the same thing, but those are the things that we're looking at now in conjunction with the Ministry of Health in particular to start to measure some of the things. Now, taking into consideration that we have, I guess Amanda could back me up here, BSAC and NAPSAC, two major sporting events within the school system. There's lots of cricket tournaments, netball, you just name it, football, all of these things that go on within our school system. What you can measure quite easily from that aspect, but where you have, I suppose you could call this the break in the chain, it's after these children leave school. You know, there's a huge gap in terms of what happens after that. I mean, school is kind of like mandatory for you to get involved in sports. But after that, we've seen a reduction in football clubs, a reduction in cricket clubs, sporting clubs in general. And I think that is where we need now to really put a huge effort. And once we have those things back, I think we'll be able to have a better measurement in terms of that. Now, on the financial side, unfortunately, those figures would come from tourism in terms of sporting events that go on and things like that. And that's one of the things that we need to change even here in terms of who satellite account it is that can measure and give you that information. So those are things that we need to work on. But going forward, I think we'll be better able to answer those types of questions once we get those satellite accounts and those things sorted out ourselves.
Well, Ministers, I just want to say that it's been fantastic to have you on the program. I think we will continue discussion for another 15 minutes or so, but I understand that we'd given you a time range and you'd expressed to us that there were some time constraints going forward. So I want to thank both of you really for spending this time and for giving us insight, because as you said, there's that leap that you want from the Qurani and there's a reality that we have on the ground. And how do we mix that? We don't envy you at all, but it sounds very much as if there's some thought for the future with the funding. There's some intercollaboration that's going to take place after this, as Minister Cox had said, and that the realities are very similar across the region. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank both Minister John King and Orlando Cox for joining us on the Sports Forum. We will certainly wish to have you back in the future, but we really appreciate the time you spent with us.
But thank you very much. I would love to come back sometime.
Yeah.
Yes, no problem. I would love to come back. But I want to leave on one important note, and I think I probably should do that. As regards to the funding, and one may say that the issue of how we operate from a regional standpoint has not been much success collectively. But I believe that we can get this done in Grenada, and probably I can see here now that we will take the lead to establishing that fund to show that it can work. We believe that it can work. We have some ideas already how we can implement it here from a national standpoint, and we welcome other persons when we achieve that success. Persons can be willing to replicate it so that other countries can benefit. But I believe that it can work.
Well, we look forward to the Cox King plan.
Definitely.
You heard it here, the Faculty of Sport Forum.
Definitely. It's a pleasure to be on. And anytime, once I'm free, please call on me, and we'll feel free to engage me in any capacity, even on the culture side. So, and Mr. King is there. We have even more challenges on the cultural side, and you wouldn't want to hear the headache on the cultural side as regards to sports. Sports is not that bad currently in terms of the impact of COVID.
Indeed. Yeah, so well, thank you both, Ministers. I'm going to turn now to Kervin John, who had his hand up for a while, wanting to make a comment. Kervin, we have Chris with us still, very passionate, and the two of you seem to have some strong views about sport, both of which really will push our sports forward, but it's a matter of prioritization perhaps. So Kervin.
Yes, Chair. Actually, some of what Mr. Stokes is saying, I agree to. However, I do think if you're looking at holistic sport development, it has to be done in collaboration. Each side has to be done in collaboration with the other. One of the things that I wanted to respond to, however, was what Minister King said with regards to, in terms of, and also Mr. Stokes, our focus on sport development. We would have focused a lot of money and a lot of our expenditure go to specific sports. So the high participation rate sports and those what we call high performing sports or podium sports, we tend to expend a lot of our monies towards. If we look at the Caribbean, we have natural environment that can facilitate certain sport types, but we tend to overlook those for those sports that we deem to be more intrinsic or at a higher level. If you look at, for instance, we have a number of beaches in the Caribbean. When you look at sand soccer, we look at beach volleyball, even beach cricket. These are vastly growing sports, a lot of which have a lot of economic benefits. If you look at free range running, like hike trailing, ecotourism more or less, with trail hiking, trail running, and those extreme sports that are growing fast in other regions that we tend to discredit or we don't pay any attention to, that we have the natural environment for, that don't require a lot of investment, that don't require any significant infrastructure, but we don't focus on those sports. And these are sports that our athletes can easily make it to an international championship and quite easily win. But instead, we forego those sports and we tend to focus on the footballs, the athletics, and those that require significant investment. I do think that during this time especially, we have an opportunity to go back to the drawing board, assess our current position, look at it in the context that we are not going to be receiving as much funding as possible, and see how best we can actually allocate those resources across those areas where we have greater returns on our investment. So I do think we need to look at what sports we participate in, and as well as which sports bring the most utility to our current athletes and persons who are participating at the current level we're at.
Okay, Kervin, I want to bring in Mr. Stokes here, but I want to put out a question to both of you, because I want to go back to the concept of the entrepreneur in sport. And I know Mr. Stokes alluded to that in his earlier comments, because as an entrepreneur myself in culture and other activities, I find it interesting that sometimes the policy does not facilitate the entrepreneurial or the business side of it. And I'm interested to kind of point the discussion towards, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will want to hear about this, to what extent does an entrepreneur have to sit and wait on government policy? What are some of the things they can do now? Because you're speaking about sports that you deem right now that we can tap into, not much investment from an infrastructural point of view. There is participation. I know in beach volleyball specifically is very popular, an Olympic sport. So how do we now start to move that gray area that Mr. Stokes spoke about and to get some more clarity in terms of direction? Mr. Stokes, do you want to take that one? And then Kervin, you're free to.
Yes. I'm sure Kervin could probably speak a little bit more to it than I can. But allow me to start. But allow me to go back a little bit. And I'm not letting Dean Mansingh off the hook on this one. I put to the ministers with great confidence the question about measurement and results and so on in the area of sport. And the irony of us, as I'm putting on my academic hat here as a researcher, the irony of us asking this on a UWI platform did not miss me. And I hope Sharmila is listening. I think the Faculty of Sports has a role to play in doing research in these areas, publishing, advocating, for example, the measurement of sports contribution to GDP and have it reported by in our case, the Planning Institute of Jamaica. But let me leave that on the table, and I'm sure Dr. Mansingh will have a view on that. On the other thing, Mr. King said something before. We have to stop following what people are doing. If we can be good at rock climbing, beach games, and so on, we have to be able to make that change in our mind that yes, we can do this and support that sort of activity. It is a natural part of the human condition where we want to do what has already been done and what has brought somebody else glory. I'll give you a quick example. People talk about the success of Jamaica in track and field. And people talk about, well, it's the YAM or it's Boys and Girls Championships. Let me give you another perspective. In 1948, Arthur Wint, who would have celebrated his 100th birthday on last Monday, the 25th of May, went to London and won a silver in the 800 meter and a gold in the 400 meter. And West Indians in the UK, who are at the bottom of the social ladder, had a pep in their step for weeks after. And that is how Jamaicans define themselves, as we are world beaters in track and field. And frankly, in my estimation, the mindset that created explains more. I don't have the research, Dr. Mansingh, so don't kill me. The R squared, the amount that it explains in terms of our athletic success to now is more than champs, I believe, or in fact, champs may have gotten a boost out of that, contributed to it in the first place and gotten a boost out of that. So it's not easy to say don't do this, do that.
Well, Chris,
but we have seen it done.
Yes, Chris,
I'm going to actually a javelin thrower from Grenada win.
Yeah, Chris, I'm actually going to step in here just to answer some of those things, because I think before we lose that point, because you'd mentioned things like studying economic impact, you'd mentioned things like the impact of champs and so on our success in Jamaica, and you'd mentioned the role of the Faculty of Sport. And I just want to point out 2 or 3 things. Number one, we're a fairly young faculty, but we have a PhD program it's starting quite robustly. And just yesterday, one of our PhD candidates, Mr. Wavell Hines, who you may know from another sphere, presented his first seminar on the economic impact of CPL in the Caribbean. And that is what he is studying, and that is what he's looking at. Not just CPL, but T20 and cricket being affected in the Caribbean and the economy. So he's linking sports with economy as a PhD. And I say that because the way the university can facilitate this is in one of 2 ways. We can do our own studies, yes, and we can do them with Planning Institute of Jamaica or any other country. But another way, and a way that we look at very favorably, is for people to come to us and say, can you study this problem, and offer a scholarship for somebody to do it. And very early o'clock, somebody had approached us in Jamaica saying that we want to find out why it is that the top high schools in champs are not the athletes who win medals for Jamaica. And what are the factors that lead to Jamaica winning medals, and why these top schools in champs are not producing the medalists. Now that's something we'd love to study, but we need some sort of collaboration with people from private sector or with sporting bodies to provide the scholarship, because we can provide the academic leadership to study these problems. It's not just a Jamaican thing. In Barbados, the economic impact of sport in Barbados is phenomenal from a tourism perspective around the Caribbean. I sat on a government body some years ago called Sport Jamaica, or Jamaica Sport it was called, and it was about bringing in sporting events to Jamaica. And we actually had a matrix. It was a commercial product, but it was a matrix that looked at not just when the sport came to Jamaica, but how many heads in beds you had in terms of hotel rooms that were taken, and what sort of economic spin-offs were accrued from people coming in for things like basketball competitions at a secondary level, or lower level volleyball competitions, not just national and world championships. And you'll be surprised what sort of little investment we needed for great returns, and we had that as a matrix. So the answer is yes, we're here to serve that as a Faculty of Sport, but we also need the partnerships, especially as a fledgling faculty, with government bodies, NGOs, and I know you sit as first Vice President of Jamaica Olympic Association, to drive that sort of study through some funding to answer these questions, because they're very, very important questions. But I just wanted to sort of interject at that point, because I think it addressed, you hit those things perfectly on the head there.
Yes, and I want to encourage that. I want to, and we have spoken otherwise, and I'm very familiar, for example, with the project that you're speaking about. But we need to keep that issue in the light, which is, I think, is what we are doing here now. And it's you know, we can't say, well, we should have had a Faculty of Sport 20 years ago. We have it now, right? We have one now. So let's start from where we are, and how do we make it happen? But make no mistake, I mean, we're talking about, you know, all kinds of things. We are good at sport. We're not going to make cars like the Japanese. We're not going to make watches like the Swiss. But we are good at sport. So let us double down and be creative in it, in studying it on the academic side, in funding the support of it. You know, it's probably easier to get a study to see if there's oil off of the coast than to see how do we develop sport and monetize it. And
well, which is more likely to make money.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're talking, right, okay. You're talking about a small investment. So let's get the thing right. But if I can get back, though, to Kervin's idea, you know, you asked at the beginning of the program, what are the good things that have come out of COVID-19? And Kervin said, well, the list isn't long. But one of the good things is we don't need to continue thinking the way that we have been thinking. And we don't need a global pandemic to force us to think better. If we have the discipline, we can say, you know what? I, by myself, I'm going to create a Barbadian sport that takes advantage of some mix of swimming and beach and hiking.
Have you heard of road tennis?
Only through Barbados.
And yet it's such a good sport, and something I think should be promoted as a Bayesian sport, as a Caribbean sport. And
a guy, one of the biggest sports in the world now, a guy have people playing table tennis with a football.
Yes.
Right? Massive.
Amanda, are they looking at road tennis as a big thing?
Yeah.
Yes, Minister King and I had a meeting today, actually. Going to bring it to faculty board shortly. You're going to be very excited to hear. You're hearing it hot off the press here now in this forum. But we are on our way to signing an MOU with Loughborough University, the Ministry of Sport, the Faculty of Sport, I represented as Dean, and it's another institution in Barbados as well. And we are collaborating on one, looking at the science of road tennis, two, monetizing it from in terms of design and technology of the racket and the court and the research and everything. There's a whole packaged proposal that we're working on in the form of an MOU. Ministry of Sport is funding it. Faculty of Sport is going to be bringing in academic leadership and insight and students and everything. So we're going to be happy to promote that shortly in a few weeks or so. But these are the type of ideas that Mr. Stokes is speaking about, thinking outside of the box. I know you don't like to use that terminology, but it is very much required right now, especially as we are in a pandemic and coming out of one. I know Kervin was itching to bring some comments to bear on matters that Mr. Stokes has spoken about. So Kervin, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Actually, Amanda, one of the things I wanted to respond to was with Mr. Dean's comment. There is no joke, there is no lie about it. There's no hiding the fact that there is a dearth of sport-related data in the Caribbean region. That's one thing a lot of us have not been doing, is doing research with regards to the impact of sport, what is happening in sport that would inform sport development. And that is something the faculty, and by extension, the Open Campus Academy of Sport, which has remit over the 14 countries, we are embarking on doing. We'll do it through the various ministries and what have you to get that going, but it is something that we are looking at. So it's worth mentioning, and I thank you for bringing that up, Mr. Stokes. In response to the question you posed, Amanda, with regards to policy development and how it is supposed to be, I think national policy is supposed to be comprehensive enough to cater to the needs of the specific jurisdiction. A lot of the time we tend to look out internationally to see what is happening in the wider world with regards to policy, and we frame our policies in that context. That is something I don't believe in. I think policy should be developed based on the jurisdiction, because what is working in one jurisdiction may not work in your jurisdiction. More so, we tend to take bits and pieces from international or those bigger countries, those sporting nations, and we implement them, notwithstanding the fact that those initiatives form part of a bigger program, so that we end up later down the line, 2 years down the line, with a failed program that we cannot account for. But I do think policy has to be comprehensive enough. So it shouldn't be that you develop a 5-year policy or 10-year policy today, and you have to go back to the drawing board 2 or 3 years down the line. It has to be comprehensive enough, and it has to look forward at what may come your way and put things in place to direct a path to the amelioration of those problems or the solution to those problems. Now, in the Caribbean region, we tend to have a short outlook. We tend to be reactive somewhat. But I do think if you're looking at comprehensive policy development, your policy should be looking at every single aspect, not just sport development, not just total participation, but we should also look at the business of sport and other aspects, whereas infrastructure, the competitive side of sport, and other aspects that will make it indeed a truly holistic policy. And I do want to add to Mrs. Stokes' comment about the local games. I look at it not just as local games, but we in the Caribbean need to have a mindset moving forward, whether it be in this environment or post this current environment. We need to look at what sport forms we can adopt, not just for participation's sake, but those that we can monetize in the Caribbean. Look at those sport forms that we have the environment that is conducive to them, and how we could actually develop them where we monetize them, so that it's not that we're developing persons or athletes to go out there and participate in similar sports, but we're developing competitions that the wider world can then come to the Caribbean to participate in. And not doing it on the back end, but doing it on the front end. I think in sport, we tend to follow those nations. And I think we need to jump ahead of the curve at this point in time.
Okay, Kervin, let me ask a question before I hand over to Mr. Stokes. I have a question for him. When you say we have to, define we, because oftentimes in these discussions, we don't actually pinpoint who is responsible for this. So you spoke so eloquently about entrepreneurship and what we need to do. Who is we? And before you answer, just got a message from my colleague Mark Hill, who said Design Council is the fourth partner in this project. My apologies, Mark, if you're listening. I know you're tuned in. Design Council, Ministry of Sport in Barbados, Faculty of Sport, as well as Loughborough University. Just had to say that. Sorry, Mark. Go ahead, Kervin. The point about
when I say we, I speak of we in the context of the Caribbean as a sport administrator. So in the region, most sport is predominantly run by there are some regional bodies. You have CONCACAF and what have you. You also have the ministries of sport with the responsibility for sport. A lot of what happens on the ground goes through the ministry and the executory organizations. And I think we are the ones inclusive, or especially the International Olympic Committee and the Olympic committees. We are responsible for that. We could work with the national governing bodies to institute that change. So when I say we, and I do think the general public, it falls on the back of the general public as well, because they inform what happens in sport. It's a collective, as collective stakeholders, they have a say. And more so, if they don't buy into those initiatives, a lot of time those initiatives will fail. So in terms of informing and educating the general public, I think with the sport administrators across the region and the executory companies and bodies, we need to collectively come together and start putting those plans into focus and action, to be honest.
Amanda, I think we could have we need a second segment to this program because Parliament had asked for an extension.
Are we out of time?
But what we'll do is have a final comment from Chris, and then we might have to wrap it up for this time, and obviously have to come back for a second segment. So Chris, some final thoughts and comments from you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to congratulate the Faculty of Sport at the university for putting this together. I've been on many participated economic sports, all kinds of things, but I don't know if it's the theme. I've listened to all of them, but this is particularly important for the region. So congratulations. That's the first thing. Second thing is the design and implementation of a policy that in the use of sport for national development is important, and we need to keep championing that and maybe suggesting through the university, framework within that can be developed so that nothing is left out. My final point is that in that framework of policy development, I think for me, as a non-traditional sport guy, who have seen people working in the petroleum industry in Trinidad make an oil drum into a musical instrument, who have seen a religion and 3 or 4 types of music, including dancehall music, being invented and created right here in Jamaica. To hear about road tennis in Barbados. Let us not be afraid of or embarrassed about our creative capacity. Let us embrace it and be bold enough to create sports that people want to come to us to see, not that we're watching. We need to learn to participate in what they do, not to minimize it. But I'm saying that we can take a more tailored approach to what we want to do. And I'd want to challenge the region as my final point. To be brave and bold and ambitious in person.
That's a positive way to end on it. But we don't want to leave our listeners behind, and we'll give the final word to them because there's a question that's just come in. Asnef.
Right, so Mark Hill has observed that during the lockdown, the energy consumption by the sports sector dropped by 60%. So his question, how does the sports sector in the Caribbean create policies to integrate renewable energy into sports?
And that's a phenomenal question because you can add to that not just renewable energy, but water recycling as well. Who wants to take that one up?
Chair, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've learned the hard way that we need to start doing that in sport. When you look at the expenditure of various governments on facility maintenance, I think it's abundantly clear that we don't have the wherewithal to maintain our facilities. So, for instance, if you look at the Caribbean Rehabilitation Center that is supposed to be the home of the Open Campus Academy of Sport that will be built in Grenada, one of the project plans going forward is that development has to be environmentally friendly and has to be utilizing sustainable renewable energy. So in terms of solar panels, reusing water for aquaculture and agriculture, that is something that has been looked at, and other governments are now inculcating such plans into their facility development. So I think it's something amazing, and again, policy has to speak towards it, and that is the direction the Caribbean is going.
And I'm going to take that as a wrap in a second by just pointing out that the Faculty of Sport, apart from having this forum, also has a bi-weekly column in the Trinidad Guardian newspaper called Sport Matters. And the next article, ironically, is going to be about climate change and sport, written by Dr. Claudette Koo-Thompson, who's our curriculum development specialist, and who's put together a framework of climate change and sport that is being championed by the Faculty of Sport. So a fantastic question by Mr. King, and something which I think we can end nicely on. I just want to thank my co-moderator, Amanda King, who's done a phenomenal job. And of course, I keep saying Amanda King, Amanda Reifer. Amanda, I have to apologize. I've been saying Amanda King all day. She's a classmate of mine and obviously top of my mind. Amanda Reifer. Of course, Mr. Nelson Chris Stokes, who we obviously have to have back, not looking back at COVID, but looking forward at what the region has to do with sport. Kervin, who's the champion of sport policy and governance. And as you've said, this has been a conversation that could have carried on for a while. We're going to come back very shortly because there are a lot of strong ideas there that we've got to develop further on. Thanks also to Ministers John King and Orlando Cox from Barbados and Grenada respectively, who had joined us earlier on. And thank you all for joining in Faculty of Sport Forum, the impact of COVID-19 on sport. And even though this is the end of this series, I can assure you we'll be back with almost monthly fora on topics of relevance. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.